Without further ado, because time is getting on, Rob Brighton is going to be talking about Slim. Is that the title of it?
That'll do. Thank you very much, Saul, and nice to see you all. No heckling from the cheap seats. Now, I'm going to do. I actually haven't got Saul's permission, but I do it anyway. I'm going to do 2 plugs tonight, please, really for your serious attention. The first is a new book. If you just take one of these and pass them around. Not by me. It's a fabulous book by a young writer called Hannah Watson, who's written a book for young readers, 8 to 16-year-olds, about the first couple of years of the Burma campaign, 1942-43. She was commissioned by the Goethe Museum, who have published it. It was funded by a wife and daughter of a Goethe officer. And she was concerned that there were no books at all about the Burma campaign for youngsters. And how do you get into this sort of stuff? And Hannah's done an amazing job. I'm really impressed. I was dragged in to do a little bit of fact checking, but it's fabulous. So please, please, please do support this. It's £9.99. We've published it on Amazon, so you can't get it anywhere else. Amazon Jeff is taking a lot of money from us, so we're looking to see whether we can self-publish somewhere else. He's taking less money than a trade publisher would have taken, so it's not too badly. But can I really commend that to you? I'm also going to commend how many people have got mobile phones on you. Put your hands up. Show me your mobile phone. Okay. If you haven't got it, I know at least one person in the audience has got it. Mark, you need to go when you go home. Go onto the App Store, either the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, and download Guidle. Guidl. And when he's got himself organised, Saul's going to be uploading some stuff on Guidle as well. Guidle is a place where anyone can upload short audio snapshots of a place. Think about it as podcasts of a place. Places of historic significance, sites of historic significance, places that you want to learn about, and perhaps you can yourselves upload material that will be useful to other people. It's free to upload. It's a fabulous new invention. It's only been out very recently, and we're whipping up support for it. It's really, really important that people understand about Guidle. Otherwise, the best apps out there, historical apps, will just sit and die. So I do need all of you, please, to download it, have a little look at it. It's a geolocated app, so wherever you are, I've done a few Guidle tours myself in London recently, so if you want the military history of Whitehall, you can listen to that. I've done a Guidle on the 3 wonderful statues outside the Ministry of Defence, one of which, of course, is Bill Slim, and I just give a few minutes description of each of those. So as you're walking down the street, you get a little beep, and say, oh, who's that statue of? Oh, there's a Guidle. Oh, Rob Lyman's on a Guidle of... There you are. So fill your boots, please. Seriously, get involved in it. It's great fun. Okay, and it's been done. We've been remarkably successful in raising the money and building the platform. It's a really, really good idea. Nothing else like it out there. Okay, well, thank you, Saul, for that, for letting me do those little plugs. It was very kind of you. Right. What can we say about Bill Slim that hasn't been said before? Well, interestingly enough, not enough has been said about Bill Slim. When people talk about Bill Slim, more often than not, they take the Richard Holmes line, which is a great line, which is that he never forgot the smell of a soldier's feet. Isn't that great? He was the archetypal soldier. He was the archetypal general. He wasn't a chateau general, if those ever existed. And that's debatable, of course. There certainly were a few chateau generals, but not as many, perhaps, as people think. Perhaps we see Slim too much in terms of his ability to motivate soldiers and in the direst of circumstances and get them to do things that otherwise they wouldn't do, and basically pull the irons out of the fire. Now that's all well and good, and we want our generals to do that, don't we? What on earth do we want generals for? We can't at least do that. But actually there's much, much more to Bill Slim than that, and I thought when I was sitting down this morning, frantically trying to think about how I can make something really, really pertinent for you guys and you, I'm going to talk about how he achieved operational success in the Burma campaign. I think Saul said to me last night, do something on Slim's genius. Well, you'll see something of Slim's genius coming out of this, I hope. Gird your loins. You're going to have to take your minds back to Burma, and bear in mind, when you're in a place like this, you can see everyone who's dozing off. Okay? Right, so I'm going to explain tonight the reasons for military success in the Burma campaign at the hands of the man who would one day become Field Marshal Bill Slim, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, and unknown to most, the man whose ideas more than anything else formed the basis of current British military doctrine. If there's one thing you need to remember Bill Slim for, is because current British military doctrine, don't worry about our lack of military capability, but the doctrine that drives the way we fought is based almost exclusively on Bill Slim. So I'm going to demonstrate today how the business of thinking about defeating the enemy in Burma was transformed in British experience in 1944 and 45 at the hands of this remarkable man. Well, the foundations of the British Army's approach to warfare, which was characterized preeminently by the careful, systematic, intelligent, coordinated, and overwhelming application of force, every single one of those words is important, were laid between 1916 and 1918, and reinforced by General Montgomery in the Northwest European campaign of 44 and 45. In fact, it was a template that he had adopted in 1917, and which he rolled out at El Alamein at the end of 1942. This particular approach to war fighting remained the cornerstone of British military thinking until the Bagnall reforms of the mid to late 1980s. If you don't know about the Bagnall reforms, Saul will have to invite me back next year, and I can talk about that in the development of British doctrine. Who knows about the Bagnall reforms? Right, well, you have to invite me. I'll do that next time. Well, the accepted syllogisms for the approach that I've just described could in part be summed up by this one, by the otherwise admirable Captain Basil Little Hart, who made the mistake of propounding this one during the Phoney War between September 1939 and May 1940. For an attacker to defeat a defender, he needs a superiority of 3-1. Because Germany does not have a superiority of 3-1 over France, he cannot win. Therefore, France will defeat Germany. Spot the problem? You don't have to be much of a military historian or a military philosopher to know that while syllogisms are sometimes helpful, this wasn't. Little Hart, as the foremost proponent at the time of what was known as the indirect approach, quite a helpful phrase, he should have known better and understood that it's not what you've got, but how you use it that matters. The problem is that the losing French army in 1940, just think, the French army in 1940 lost how many thousands of men dead? Anyone know? 500,000. 500,000, 1940. Unbelievable devastation in the French army. No one remembers that number. It's absolute. It's half the number of troops that we lost in the First World War. The Commonwealth, British Commonwealth, lost the whole of the First World War. 1940, cataclysm for France. Anyway, the problem is that the losing French army in 1940. So that's a rabbit warren. I'll try not to go down too many of them. The problem is that the losing French army in 1940 was one that also applied the model defined by the syllogism that said that success in battle was always the product of the effective and coordinated application of force. Yet in 1940, as we all know, the French were soundly beaten, humiliated even by Germany. Germany in 1940 didn't have a superiority of firepower, or what we might call military quantum, more stuff than the next place. They had far fewer tanks and aircraft, for instance, than France, but they had better ideas, more commitment, determination, chutzpah even, and a will to win that was conspicuous in the French army by its absence. Something similar to the German experience in 1940 could be said of Slim's 14th Army in 1944 and 45 in terms of orthodoxy. Slim did not have the resources which doctrine decreed he needed in order to take on the Japanese in Burma and win. Like the Germans, he didn't have a 3-1 superiority in combat power over the Japanese. But he and the 14th Army defeated them, principally by rethinking the accepted syllogisms of the past. He and it, the 14th Army, rethought what was necessary to succeed in a desperate struggle against one of the toughest opponents the British Army has ever faced in its long history. The essence of the story is that the conduct of operations in India and Burma in 1944 and 45, represented an entirely new style of warfighting to that experienced by the rest of the British Army in the Second World War, exemplified by Monty's famous teeing up, or in other words, the precise organisation, coordination and application of force from El Alamein onward. The 14th Army's experience didn't throw away the need to apply force in the most intelligent manner possible, but it did so in ways different to the received orthodoxy of the time, which assumed that force needed to be applied where the enemy was strongest. Just think about this. Soldiers like to apply force where the enemy is strong. He's got 10 tanks. Oh, I'm going to need 15. He's got 1,000 men. Oh, I'm going to need 2,000. Force on force. Just think about that as we go through this lecture. It assumes that force needs to be applied where the enemy is strongest in order to reduce or remove this opposing superiority. Instead, Slim's practice and style of warfighting can be described as one in which his strength was applied to enemy vulnerabilities or weaknesses, whether these were found in time or in space. He sought to avoid the direct confrontation of the enemy mass, and by the use of every weapon in his armoury, ballistic or otherwise, degrade the enemy's fighting power without engaging in the attritional slogging matches that came from the approach advocated by the lessons of 1916 to 1918, and which characterised much of British military operations elsewhere between 1942 and 1945. Now, there's a lot of generalisations in there, and don't come back at me about the 100 days. 100 days didn't really apply those lessons, but that's the third talk we can do. So maybe the year after next. Under Slim, an entirely different conception came into play, in which notions of subtlety, guile, and psychological dislocation came to be emphasised in an entirely new way, and one which I believe was unique to British military experience in the Second World War. It's these tools and techniques that presented a different way of thinking about how to defeat the Japanese, given that all previous attempts in 1942 and 43 using the old orthodoxies had singularly failed. So then let's just have a quick look at the Burma campaign to sort of contextualise the timeline. The war in Burma between 1942 and 45 can be arranged into 4 digestible chunks. So the first comprises the retreat from Burma in 42, followed in 43 by a period of recovery. This year also saw the first Chindit expedition into Burma under Lord Wingate. It also included a failed offensive in Arakan, and later that year, extraordinary efforts undertaken to rebuild an army, a British army and an Indian army. The two were entirely separate. They worked together, but they were entirely separate armies, used only to defeat. The third period encompassed the great turning point battles of Arakan, Kohima, and Imphal in 1944, and the fourth is the recovery of Burma itself in 1945. To do so, let's just orientate ourselves to the ground. We've got Rangoon at the bottom in Burma. We've got Mandalay in the middle of the country, and then if we move 400 miles to the north-west, we come across in the green bit in Assam. Actually, that's not Assam at all, that's Manipur. It's Imphal and India proper. Down on the left-hand side of Burma, opposite the words Bay of Bengal, the top end of that bit, is Arakan. So when I talk about Arakan, I'm talking about this area here, northern Arakan here, which is the Burmese littoral. And also note Calcutta on the left-hand side in India. And interestingly enough, if you were to, there's another rabbit warrant. What time's food? That won't take long. The journey, the line of communication from Calcutta to Rangoon in 1945 ran north up the Brahmaputra, across to Dimapur near Imphal, down to Imphal itself, across to Mandalay. It's 1,000 miles, by the way, from Calcutta to the Chimba River opposite Imphal. 400 miles to Mandalay and 400 miles down again. Do your maths? That's 1,800 miles. That's London to Moscow. In 1945, Slim was fighting a war in Burma. The distance of London to Moscow, it was like fighting in Moscow from London. So there should be no surprise amongst any of you that I get excited about this, because it's extraordinary and no one really understands how dramatic this whole war was. Dramatic in every sense. We don't have time for that. Let's crack on. Okay. Let's just quickly run through the timeline so that we've got that also stuck in our head. The Japanese attack on Burma began in late December 1941 with the aerial bombardment of Rangoon, followed by a decisive blitzkrieg-type thrust from Thailand by two well-trained and aggressive Japanese infantry divisions in February 1942, the subject of Hannah Watson's excellent new book. The tiny British garrison was driven north into India in what became the longest retreat in the history of the British Army, some 1,100 miles to Imphal, which was reached by the end of May 1942. Incidentally, the Japanese didn't intend to invade Burma, all they wanted was Rangoon. But when they applied their hot knife to the British butter, there was only one outcome. After some initial disasters during the retreat, among which was the loss of the Satang Bridge, Bill Slim was flown in from Iraq to take command of the weak 1st Burma Corps in the middle of March 1942. The professionalism of the units involved, and the fact they had some Stuart tanks, some British, some Indian and Burmese troops, was the primary reason for the success of the withdrawal from Burma under Bill Slim. True, the British had been thrown out of Burma, but the Japanese 15th Army was unable to cut off the withdrawal and allowed the tiny Burma army to limp back to India. There's a seat right at the front if you need one.
Thank you.
It also gave Slim and others a perfect schooling in Japanese tactics and an understanding of the Japanese military mind that was to stand him and them in very good stead later on. The second period of time which I've touched on was 1943. Disaster still stalked the British during the year with a poorly planned and naively executed offensive using 1916 lines of approach and attack along the Arakan coastline, petering out in some ignominy in May 1943. Wingate's first Chindan expedition, also the subject of Hannah Watson's marvellous book, The Jungle War, was, well, also, to all intents and purposes, a desperate and unsuccessful venture, was spun very effectively by General Headquarters Delhi into a propaganda story that still holds many today in its thrall, such as the power of the Chindit myth. That's another talk I'm happy to give. The third period saw, at long last, a series of great turning point battles at Kohima and Imphal during 1944, in which the Japanese were betted in the Far East by the British for the first time. And the fourth and final phase of the Burma campaign took the 14th Army from the pursuit of the Japanese out of India in 1944 across the Chinwan and Irrawaddy rivers in early 1945, the decisive battles around Mandalay and Mektila in March 1945, we'll come back to these in a moment, and the armoured dash 400 miles to Rangoon, a distance equivalent to that between Paris and Marseille, in 4 weeks in April and early May 1945. It was an operation, in my estimation, of superlatives, but has been largely forgotten in the historiography of the Second World War. There is, for example, no single authoritative account of either the great Mandalay-Mektila battles, not a single one of the great British successes of the war, nor of the dramatic armoured and airborne advance on Rangoon. Far less dramatic operations in northwest Europe boast an embarrassment of military riches by comparison, none written by Saucer. We all jump on that commercial bandwagon, sadly, as we're told to. Slim spent the time between August 1942 and February 1944 preparing his new army for war. We won't go into the detail of how it's constructed. The first test of the 14th Army took place in Arakan, that part of the map that I showed you, along Burma's northwestern littoral in January 1944. During the preceding 2 years, the Japanese had successively beaten the British in battle. They demonstrated mastery of all arms in the attack. Their troops were well trained and hardy, prepared to accept almost any hardship and sacrifice in the pursuit of their goals. They coordinated artillery, armour and air support well with attacks by infantry. Their camouflage and concealment was excellent, and they made the maximum psychological impact with their tactics of dislocation, which entailed scaring their enemies to the point that they gave up without a fight. Unlike our common conception of the Banzai attack, the Japanese rarely attacked frontally. often only doing so out of hubris or when they had given up hope and desirous of a one-way ticket home. Unfortunately, in British offensive operations against the Japanese in Arakan in 1943, operations for which Slim wasn't, by the way, responsible, although he was tempted to be sacked by his boss, even though he wasn't responsible for them. It's another story, lecture. The British deployed unthinking tactics, ones in common use that I described in the Western Front of 1916. As an aside, these tactics weren't really used in much of the British Army in 1918. The subject of a book, actually, sorry, there's another little plug here, by Richard Dunn and myself, which I recommend to you if you've got the money and the time. But so by 1918, the tactics that were used again in 1943 had been dismissed by the British Army as being ineffective. So there's a real question here about why was it that the British Army in the Second World War went back to 1914 and 15 instead of to 1918. It's quite extraordinary. There's just a dramatic amnesia in the British military mind about the lessons it had learnt and forgotten from the First World War. Anyway, the situation by early 1944, still in Arakan, was that the Japanese were dug in the hills of northern Arakan on the border between Burma and India, whence they had ejected the British in 1943. It was in January 1944 that a new set of operations were launched to evict the Japanese from strong positions they held in northern Arakan. So in 1943, the Japanese came in, and in 1943, they dug in. They were going to, they created very, very strong defensive positions in northern Arakan. The British didn't really know why they were there, what they were going to do, but they needed to be removed. The British needed to design an effective method for attacking Japanese defensive positions, given that the previous offensive approaches that I've described to solving this problem had been expensive failures. Slim recognized that one of the fatal errors of the previous Arakan campaign in 43 had been unimaginative attacks on narrow frontages, and that weight of firepower from artillery against entrenched positions made no difference to the outcome. This is again a lesson 1916 and 1917, which had been repeated foolishly in 1943. No matter how well coordinated attacks were between air, artillery, and infantry, or indeed the quality of munitions that were dropped on the enemy, it was as though artillery firepower itself was a waste of time against the Japanese. Slim knew that the answer was to avoid frontal attacks in favour of attacks from the flanks and preferably the rear, and that the best means of overcoming Japanese positions was by adopting the envelopment tactics so decisively exploited by the Japanese themselves. This would have the effect of cutting off the defence supply lines and thereby placing pressure on them where they least expected it. In time, experience in Arakan taught that the best method of attacking a Japanese defensive position was to capture ground immediately behind the main enemy position that was so vital to them, preferably on a line of communication, such that he was forced to counterattack immediately and at considerable cost to recover that ground. Well, the tragedy of war is it always takes time for lessons to be learned, and it took a long time for 15 Corps in Arakan, at the time part of Slim's 14th Army, to learn these lessons. The notion that attacks should be anything other than frontal and conventional in their execution, with artillery and tanks first neutralising and then infantry coming up and occupying, didn't at first receive universal acceptance, even among soldiers of considerable military experience, and even amongst Slim's friends, who questioned him on this. Envelopment and infiltration were, for many in the British and the Indian armies in 1943, unconventional and even unsound notions. At the very least, they entailed risk. They entailed unacceptably high levels of low-level command initiative, given the inexperience of the junior non-commissioned and commissioned officers in the Indian Army, high levels of individual and collective training, and an acceptance of operating without clearly defined supply lines. These are all things that are really important to a conventionally minded army. These are things that Slim needed to change. Well, when an offensive battle against the entrenched Japanese was initiated once more in northern Arakan in early 1945, 44, the otherwise capable 15 Corps Commander, Lieutenant General Sir Philip Christensen, and the Divisional Commander responsible, Major General Harold Briggs here, who was subsequently the architect of the Briggs Plan during the Malayan emergency, for those of you who know that, frankly made a hash of it, reverting to training and type. This, known as Operation Cudgel, entailed a corps-size approach to confront, reduce, and capture strong Japanese positions on the Mont d'Or-Bethilong Road, which they had named the Japanese had named the Golden Fortress. The whole defensive position was in considerable strength and was based around 3 powerful bastions. The defences comprised networks of deep, well-constructed, well-camouflaged bunkers that were largely impervious to any artillery fire of any caliber, 25-pounder or 5-inch shells. The offensive began in mid-January 1944. Unfortunately, the first phase was given the title of Operation Jericho. And unlike its biblical namesake, the attackers were unable to engineer the collapse of the Japanese defences, as Slim said they wouldn't. Despite all of Slim's strictures to the contrary, and to his immense frustration, Briggs's plan involved a brigade frontal assault. It failed. The wrong lesson was then learned by Christensen, who believed that the failure of Jericho had been caused by the lack of artillery and air support, and that with more weight of fire, the Japanese positions would be overrun. Another divisional attack was launched, Operation Jonathan, supported now by ground tanks, the entire Corps artillery, and 90 tons of high explosive dumped helpfully on target by the United States Army Air Force. Infantry advanced as doctrine decreed under the cover of a creeping artillery barrage first presented to the British Army in 1916, and tanks fired directly into Japanese bunkers which had been exposed from the jungle camouflaged by the aerial bombardment. But you know what's coming, don't you? Despite the weight of support provided, the infantry yet again failed to penetrate any but the bunkers on the forward slope of the Japanese positions. These Japanese positions proved virtually impregnable to frontal assault. Even 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns fired in the ground roll at point-blank range made very little impression on the Japanese log bunkers. The Japanese, to give them credit, defended tenaciously and intelligently. Small groups hidden in the jungle forward of each locality counterattacked the flanks of the attackers. As an aside, Japanese could always tell when the British and Indians were about to attack because of the planning and preparation that was needed to bring the guns into position and bring the troops into position, and they judged very finely when the attack would begin, and they scuttled out of their trenches into the jungle and reoccupied them after the attack had begun. Well, this is all very depressing stuff, isn't it? To cut a long story short, when the attacks were renewed in March 1944, Christensen and his 2 divisional commanders, Harold Briggs and Frank Messervy, changed their tactics entirely under Slim's baton, and success was achieved. Coordinated 2 divisional attacks were made not against ground which the enemy had chosen to defend, but against ground which was or could be made so vital to the enemy that the Japanese were forced to come out of their bunkers and counterattack in turn. Encirclements, hooks from left or right, and guile, the message that Slim had been preaching since the retreat in 42, replaced futile and expensive frontal assaults. Frank Messervy told his battalion commanders and his brigade commanders, as a result of this experience, that the only way to attack Japanese positions was by infiltration, which is exactly what the Japanese had always done, rather than by frontal attack. So it takes a long time for the doctrine to be replaced by pragmatic wisdom. So this is a very important tactical note written out by Frank Messervy. All experience in the Arakan has demonstrated the utter futility of a formal infantry attack supported by artillery concentrations or barrage against Japanese organized jungle positions. Normally, one appreciates that superior firepower and superior numbers are dominating assets. Here, this is not in capital. So, we shall get into trouble and have unnecessary casualties and setbacks if we fail this clearly. The right answer to capturing Japanese positions and killing Japanese in this type of country and in these tactical circumstances is quite simple. It is infiltration and encirclement for which this country is extraordinarily suitable. Well, the new tactics worked spectacularly. Infantry infiltrated behind the enemy positions and by ambush cut off the enemy's supply and reinforcement routes. Firepower was employed selectively and intelligently rather than as a battering ram. Short, rapid surprise artillery concentrations to help the infantry onto their objectives were employed in place of the lengthy bombardments which had consistently failed to make any impact on Japanese positions in the past. Again, if you know anything about the First World War, this is 1918, even Passchendaele, 1917 all over again, thinking about how we might be able to intelligently use artillery to support infantry acquiring geography. Guns pounded tracks and roads used by the enemy at night to bring up food and ammunition rather than on futile aerial bombardments, which had a negligible effect on the heavily entrenched Japanese, who had perfected the art of building these remarkable log bunkers that were resistant to even direct hits by high explosive. Bunkers were first exposed from the surrounding jungle by 25 pounds of artillery pieces, and then demolished by direct sniping by tanks. And that photograph there is a Grant tank directly attacking at probably some distance an exposed Japanese bunker. That's the next picture, I think. There we are. Cannon fire from ground attack aircraft, typically Hurricanes. You can see here bottom left. This is on the Tilden Road in Nepal. Equipped with twin underwing 250-ton bombs, known as hurry bombers, proved to be of the greatest value. Whilst the infantry were closing in on a position, dummy attacks were made by aircraft to keep the defenders' heads down during the few fighting minutes required to allow the attacker into the enemy's trenches. Tanks were also used to get behind enemy positions to snipe against the reverse slope bunkers in the reverse of their position, so they could be neutralized and destroyed. Well, the gap in time between the first and the second parts of Operation Cudgel were taken up by fighting off a major Japanese counter-offensive into the Korea area, known to history as the Battle of the Admont Locks at a place called Simsware. So I mentioned that the Japanese had turned up, they dug in, and we didn't know what they were going to do next. Well, what they were going to do next was Operation Argo, Operation Z, because they faked for their major invasion of India. So they turned up in February 1944 and fought this Battle of the Admont Locks. Well, one of the questions facing Slim in 1943 was how to overcome the devastating Japanese tactics of envelopment and infiltration, tactics which in the past had exploited every weakness in the British Army's doctrine of linear defence. Armies lined up to face the enemy. It's the done thing. The solution to this problem was developed in detail by Slim during the monsoon of 43. Slim's plan involved the age-old idea of a defensive area or box, which could be formed by units of any size when they had been surrounded by the enemy. The difference now was that they could be resupplied by air. When surrounded, units were trained to withdraw immediately into a defensive posture that then formed the strong pivot of future action. Slim used this phrase about hammer and anvil. The anvil was going to be the box that the troops on the ground created, and which then struck back aggressively against their attackers. And these tactics meant that the Japanese could themselves be attacked and cut off from their own supply lines. All troops, from fighting formations to supporting units of every description without exception, were trained to turn themselves instantly into self-sufficient strongholds and to stand fast if bypassed. Think about traditional military operations where you've got the teeth arms, combat arms up the front fighting the bad guys, and then behind them you've got combat support, so artillery and engineers. Then you've got combat service support, they're all the people who feed guys in the front and give them ammunition. Well, what the Japanese had done is simply infiltrate behind the front lines and attack the rear, attack the CS and the CSS, so the supply people. And that caused an enormous problem because under old doctrine, the British and the Indian armies had no idea what to do. Of course, if everyone was trained to be a fighting man, and they all defended or created boxes wherever they might be, they could then fight back against the Japanese and then pull the sting out of this particular Japanese challenge. Again, in 1944, these plans by Bill Slim worked spectacularly. Following the initial Japanese attacks, a British counterattack by the Corps Reserve 26th Division began immediately from the north, whilst units cut off from the melee were ordered to congregate into divisional boxes. They started off in platoon, company, and battalion boxes, and as time went by and they could work out where the Japanese were and what was going on, they congregated themselves into bigger divisional boxes to fight off the Japanese. 2 divisions here, 5 and 7 divisions, Indian. Units stayed where they were and, supplied by air, fought off ferocious and increasingly desperate Japanese attacks as the days passed. Although they made frantic efforts, the Japanese failed to break through. British reserves moved quickly down from Chittagong, and in weeks the Japanese supply system collapsed completely. And I need just to tell you that the Japanese were entirely reliant on capturing British rations and equipment in order to sustain their advance. They didn't carry anything themselves. They knew from experience in 1942 that the British, according to Muriguchi Renu, were weaker than the Japanese, weaker than the Chinese rather, and all you needed to do was capture their rations and you could live like a king. Not so in February 1944. The Japanese offensive in Arakan thus ended in serious failure. The Arakan battles were the first of the turning points in 1944. For the first time, a major Japanese attack had been heavily defeated in pitched battle by British and Indian formations, and their well-tried envelopment tactics successfully defeated by air supply and battle discipline on the ground. Very heavy losses had been inflicted on the enemy, on the ground and also in the air, and the myth of Japanese invincibility, a really, really critical success story for Slim, was exploded forever. The Japanese weren't Superman, they could be defeated by ordinary Indian, by ordinary British soldiers. The effect, therefore, of the victories on the morale of the 14th Army was very marked. Indeed, the Arakan battle steeled and gave confidence to the army for the first time. I don't usually like pumping my competitors, but James Holland's written a brilliant book on this called Burma 1944. It's just about the battle of it's not just about the battle, it's focused on the battle of the Admin Bogs, Sims Way Out, February 1944. And it's worth getting. It was published a few years ago. The title is a little bit misleading, but it's just about Arakan battles. But it's very, very good and well done. You tell them I said that.
I think I reviewed it. Very positive.
It's a great book. He's a very good historian. The second great test came just as those battles in Arakan were dying away. At Kohima and Imphal in March 1944, Slim was faced with the question of how to defeat and turn back Operation Ugo, the Japanese march on Delhi, and the invasion of India itself. The plan that Slim determined upon was one that he hoped would play to British strengths and exploit Japanese weaknesses in the way that I described earlier. Clustered in the hills that surrounded the Imphal plain, he planned to entice Motoguchi's 15th Army, about 105,000 men, into a major battle in India in circumstances favourable to the British. It was nevertheless hugely risky. It was clear to both Slim and to Lieutenant General Geoffrey Scoots, commander of the 4th Corps in Assam, and the 2 forward divisions, Panchkal and 17th Indian Division, interestingly enough, and exclusively Gurkha Division south of Imphal, and Douglas Gracie's 20th Indian Division southeast of Tamil. 4th Corps had 3 divisions, 17, 20, and 23. And it was clear to the Corps commander and Slim that, unable by dint of geography to support each other, they needed to be brought back to congregate, to work together, without which they'd be very easy prey to Japanese encirclement. That is the standard Japanese tactic, of course. The Japanese would want to encircle them and defeat them in detail. Nor would it be possible for them to withdraw into fully defensive boxes in the forward locations because air supply didn't exist in the quantities necessary to leave the divisions where they were. So Slim's plan was to withdraw the divisions back to defensive positions more central in Imphal. So instead of keeping his forces forward and investing in a strong defensive barrier along the Chinwan to the east and the south, Slim decided that he would instead withdraw his troops as I've described. The Japanese would be encouraged to advance deep into Manipur, whilst the 2 forward Indian divisions, the 17th and 20th, would withdraw from their advanced positions, which they had been consolidating since 1943. They were there, actually, in order to prepare for an advance into Burma when the time came. So they were surrounded by stocks and equipment and ammunition. They weren't defensive positions per se, and frankly, both divisional commanders were a little bit cross at the suggestion they might have to leave all this behind and withdraw back to Imphal. But the plan was that they would withdraw back to high points around Imphal, where the 3rd Division, Major General Andrew Roberts, 23rd Indian Division, the Corps Reserve, would support both against Japanese attacks. Key points, including Imphal town itself and the 6 airfields on the plain, would be transformed themselves into their own boxes, defensive bastions capable of defending themselves unaided for a period of at least 10 days. So this box concept was also important into Imphal. Allowing the Japanese to advance directly onto Imphal would stretch Japanese supply lines through more than 100 miles of jungle-clad hills from the Chinwe. By contrast, 4 Corps, by withdrawing, would enjoy vastly reduced lines of communication and benefit from concentration. I was tired of fighting the Japanese when they had a good line of communications behind them, and I had an inexorable one, Slim reasoned in 1944. This time I would reverse the procedure. So yes, Slim, great mind. He's learning a lot from the Japanese. He's very pragmatic. He's solving problems as and when they arise. With Slim's plan, it would then be possible for the British to take advantage of their growing strength in aircraft, armour and artillery, while simultaneously exploiting the enemy's weakness in logistics and resupply. Problems that would be compounded by the onset of the monsoon at the end of April. And I've stopped mentioning the monsoon in that sort of way a long time ago, because I have to explain what the monsoon means to anyone who's never experienced it. Now, we've had a very wet year. In my part of the world, not very far from here, we had 28 inches, which is our annual rainfall in a month. So we would normally expect this country to have an average of 34 or 36 inches of rain in this country. The monsoon in this part of the world, when it starts at the end of April, early May, and it falls to October, drops between 300 and 500 inches in that period of time. So dismiss the idea of some rain showers. This is really, really serious water. There's a small monsoon, the Chota monsoon, which comes in January, which we were caught in it slightly earlier this year, but there's just a few drops of rain. Most of the rain comes between May and October, and it's absolutely massive. Well, of course, Japanese are coming across the Chinwe in March. They began their offensive on the 18th of March. They expect to have Imphal captured by the 29th of April, which incidentally is the Emperor's birthday, but it's also when the monsoon's about to start. Slim judged that if he could fight them off until then, until the rain started to fall, the Japanese would then be fighting the elements as well. So a lot of smart thinking in his plan. But in withdrawing, Slim risked undermining the still delicate morale of his army. Not only were withdrawals difficult to manage, but failure would have a terrible effect on the morale of his troops, which he and his commanders had built up so painstakingly over the previous months after the disasters of 1942 and 43. Withdrawal will also have a correspondingly negative effect politically on friends and allies. And I don't have time to talk about this tonight, but Burma was a strategically, politically very sensitive part of the world, given the fact that the British were there not to recover Burma for their own selfish purposes and purposes of imperial aggrandizement, but to suit the needs of Roosevelt's strategy to help China. That was what it was all about. China was everything. Slim knew that there was no guarantee that his Fourth Corps would be able to successfully withdraw at the required moment, particularly if it was engaged in combat with the enemy. There was also no guarantee either that the defences of the Imphal plain would be sufficient to defeat every attempt by the enemy to break in, or that he could reinforce Fourth Corps quickly when required. But if the Imphal defences were strong enough, and if Slim could maintain a steady flow of reinforcements and supplies by some means, the Japanese would merely exhaust their strength in ultimately fruitless attempts to overwhelm the defenders. Now, these were all big ifs. To be successful, Slim's plan would require careful planning, a finely honed assessment of his own troops' capabilities, and the ability to juggle limited resources between competing priorities at a moment's notice. What was certain was that the battle would be a long, bloody confrontation where the victim would require perseverance as well as considerable reserves of both moral and material strength. There were some, indeed, who opposed Slim's plan. It was altogether too sensitive a concept for many at the time, the withdrawal in advance of contact. I was not surprised, Slim wrote later, to find it hard to convince many, especially highly placed civil officials, that it was possible to fight defensively and even to retreat, yet keep the initiative. By withdrawing, he lay open to the charge that he had lost his nerve and lacked the courage to stand and fight the Japanese. Rather than suffer the indignity of retreat, Slim was encouraged by some not to withdraw, but to anticipate the enemy by launching his own preemptive attack across the Chinwen. Throw your divisions across the Chinwen. Such suggestions he quickly dismissed. Had I accepted their advice, Slim recalled, the enemy could easily have concentrated along good communications, a force greatly in excess of any we could maintain east of the Chinwen. We would have fought superior numbers with the dangerous crossing of a great river behind us and with our communications running back through 120 miles of the worst country imaginable. It was not ground that mattered, he argued consistently during 1944, but the opportunity to engage on ground of his own choosing the might of the Japanese 15th Army. That done, he said, territory could easily be reoccupied. How right he was. I didn't have time, and nor indeed would you be interested in tonight, so because there's supper coming, I think, hearing me expound the story of those battles, but I'd be delighted to at some future time. Suffice to say, the Japanese march on Delhi was stopped in the hills around Imphal and at the mountaintop village of Kohima in a series of discrete battles that raged between March and August 1944, and in which only a remnant of Mutaguchi's proud 15th Army escaped. Another little plug here, very good book by Fergal Key. He's not a military historian, but he did a good job on this, called Road of Bones, which focuses on Kohima and the first part of the siege of Kohima. Kohima had a siege and a battle as well. Fergal focuses on the first part, and it's particularly good on the Japanese experience. Try to get to the next slide and say that. There we are. Okay. The final example of this new means of fighting war took place in the early months of 1945 as the 14th Army poured across the Chinwen and prepared to confront the Japanese in Burma itself. Operation Extended Capital was without doubt one of the classic accounts in the history of war of the power of maneuver, the ability to not just to move in space, but to move in time and in the mind of the enemy. Maneuver is not just about mobility, it's about thinking about how you use all your forces in an effective way to entirely destabilize the whole basis of an enemy's plan. Admittedly rather sore at being outclassed, General Kimmerer, commander of the Burma Area Army, described it, Slim's Operation Extended Capital, as the masterstroke of the war. Slim's original plan, as you can see on this map, let me just show you, it's not the best map. I was struggling to find something really good this morning. We've got middle of Burma here with Mandalay here, the Irrawaddy running down here and then doing a little dog leg across here, joining up to the Chinwen and dropping down 400 miles to the coast. Slim's moving his army across, in the first place, these units, signs, across what is known as the Shuebo Plain to fall down to Mandalay. And that's where we have it. He's got two corps, the 33rd and the 4th Corps. And the original plan under Operation Capital was to cross Burma and drop down to Mandalay, capture Mandalay, create an anchor by which he could then undertake offensive operations to recapture the rest of Burma. This original plan was good because the terrain would be well suited to the deployment of armour. Slim now had quite a lot of it, for which the Japanese had little effective reply, and the Japanese would be trapped with a river at their back, the Irrawaddy. Slim had assumed in his planning that the Japanese would be unprepared to make a voluntary withdrawal. They didn't like withdrawing, they liked coming out to fight. They had this idea that martial valor was defined by their ability to fight, so they always sought battle. And the real challenges of the Japanese leadership, one of the reasons for their failure in 44 was always seeking battle. They were good at battle. They were very bad at fighting war. We don't have time for that. But Slim assumed that that's what the Japanese would do. So the scene was set for Slim to be able to deploy his superior mobility and firepower above Mandalay to destroy the main Japanese army in Burma. By the end of that year, by mid-December, the troops were crossing the Chinwan and carrying out this plan. It became apparent to Slim that the Japanese were not going to conform to his plan for battle. And General Kimura had seen the trap which his force would be caught in if they attempted to stand and fight on the Shuebo Plain, so on the northern bank of the Irrawaddy. Showing unusual flexibility for a Japanese commander and indeed moral courage, Kimura promptly withdrew his 15th Army behind the Irrawaddy. Kimura hoped, not without reason, to be able to smash Slim's army as it attempted to cross the river around Mandalay, which in itself presented an immense obstacle to the British. He would then counterattack and destroy Slim as the British withdrew during the monsoon back to the Chinwan. So Kimura's move behind the Irrawaddy destroyed at a stroke Slim's plan. Undaunted and recognizing the supreme importance of destroying Kimura's army rather than taking ground for its own sake, Slim came up with Operation Extended Capital. This entailed continuing his advance across northern Burma, or Upper Burma as it was known then, to fight the Japanese on the Irrawaddy above Mandalay, but also to drive his armoured corps, the 4th Indian Corps, through 300 miles of jungle, through the Gangaur Valley, on a road that didn't yet exist, to the Irrawaddy, cross the Irrawaddy, and strike at the Burma Area Army at a place called Mektila, an hour and a half's drive south of Mandalay. Mektila was the nodal point for the defence of Burma. It was where all the airfields were, where the railway stopped and divided coming up from Rangoon to Mandalay. If Slim could capture Mektila, Kimura's defence of Mandalay would be undone. It was a very, very audacious concept. In order to be able to move his 4th Corps down, he needed to do so in secret. He needed to ensure that Kimura believed that the advance on the northern side of the Irrawaddy was the whole of the 14th Army, not just one corps, the 33rd Corps. So he created a fake headquarters, corps headquarters, with an entire single squadron responsible for creating all the noise of an advancing corps, 2 corps moving on the Irrawaddy. But of course, it was all entirely a subterfuge. Slim hoped that these moves, so 33 Corps in the north, 4 Corps driving down to Mektila through the jungle, would completely unhinge Kimura's front and disrupt the balance of his forces. And if successful, it would also lead to the destruction of Kimura's army. That was the plan. It relied entirely for its success on secrecy, on speed, and of taking huge administrative risks. Think about taking an entire army corps through the jungle down one road that had yet to be bulldozed. It's really quite audacious, but that really sums up Slim, and it sums up the art of the possible in terms of where the 14th Army was at that point. Let me just have another little boring conversation. How do you cross the Chinwan when you don't really have any bridges? You've got enough bridging, you've got enough Bailey bridging material to create one bridge, but that's going to be very, very vulnerable to Japanese air intelligence. How do you get across? Well, in June 1944, Slim was sitting there asking the same question. How do I cross the Chinwan when I come to it? How do I cross the Irrawaddy, 2 of the world's greatest rivers? Don't talk to me about the Rhine crossing. This is really, really serious stuff. Well, I'll tell you what he did. He got his 14th Army to build, stand by for this, 550 10-ton barges. 550 10-ton barges. They chopped down some teak forest, used elephant Bill's elephants to bring them all together. They created sawmills, they chopped them all up, they slapped the roughly hewn wood together. They covered it in pitch. This is northern Burma. There's a lot of oil bubbling up from the ground. They covered it in pitch. 550, a 10-ton barge was sufficient to carry a Sherman tank. When I first went to Burma in 1999, they were still using some of these barges on the Irrawaddy to transport tea logs. I mean, unbelievable. So this is an army that created its own solutions to problems it faced. How do you cross a mighty river? You solve that problem yourself. You create a little flotilla. There's lots of funny stories about that, but we don't have time for it. Anyway, Slim's plan was to place unacceptable pressure at the times and places which the enemy least expected. Operation Extended Capital was focused on persuading Kimmerer that he was faced by insurmountable odds. Just think, you Kimmerer, you're in Mandalay, you're seeing an army come towards you, you've deployed your army to defeat the enemy on the river, then all of a sudden you've got effectively a corps, an armoured corps, biting your ass in Mektina. I mean, it really is quite staggering stuff. Kimmerer had no response to it. I'm ad-libbing a little bit here because of time. But the truth is that Slim's feint in the north and his bold attack on the south to seize Mektina completely surprised and dislocated the Japanese at every level of command, so that they were finally forced to admit that the battle for Upper Burma could not be won. Now, the successes of 1944 and 45 were brought about by an army that needed to do things differently to the received wisdom that it had inherited and which I've described. A number can be regarded perhaps as tactical themes and a number operational principles. The major tactical ones stress the design of new approaches to the defence. I've talked about the box, and for the offence, as we have noted. They also emphasise an entirely new approach to training based on the principle that if our troops needed to defeat the Japanese in battle, they need to be tougher and more resilient than their enemy. It all sounds pretty obvious, but these are things that need to be learned. The operational principles included those you can see on the slide, and I'll just pick out a couple of these. Three of these tactical and operational principles are worth quickly elaborating as we're near the end. First, by 1944, British and Indian forces in eastern India had been strenuously retrained and prepared to withstand the extraordinary physical and mental demands required of men fighting the Japanese. Slim recognised that he had to start afresh and build his army from bottom up, specifically to take on and defeat the Japanese. Every army, if you're creating an army to defeat an enemy, first of all work out who you're going to fight, work out what their strengths and weaknesses are, work out how they're going to fight, and build your plan accordingly. Again, it's not rocket science. That's why we're soldiers. They don't employ rocket scientists. An army designed to fight the Germans and Italians in North Africa, for instance, was entirely ill-prepared to contemplate the rigors of fighting the Imperial Japanese Army in the Far East. Training in simulated battlefield conditions, known as battlefield inoculation, enabled soldiers to cope with the demands of fighting a tenacious enemy in the harsh, visible environment of both mountain, jungle, and monsoon. Likewise, Slim was certain that if men were adequately prepared to overcome these challenges, if they were helped to do so by better medical care, especially to prevent the mass casualties caused in 42 and 43 by malaria, and if the lines of communication that supplied troops in forward areas with food, fuel, and ammunition were made more secure by using air supply rather than by relying on tracks and roads, morale would improve, and with it the troops' certainty that they could defeat the Japanese in battle, and so it proved. Despite the demands posed by the torrential monsoon rains that I've described, physical toughening, weapon training, and long cross-country marches on foot and with mules carried out over hills, through jungle and across rivers became routine. Live firing with rifles, machine guns, and grenades in realistic conditions, often at the end of exhausting marches over huge distances in day and night, and through the dank, sun-parched jungle, was practiced constantly. Exercises ranged from patrol actions by sections and platoons, ambushes up to company level, to battalion attacks coordinated with artillery and aircraft. Training was hard and embraced every soldier and every type of unit, including men who at earlier times in the Indian Army would have been regarded as non-combatants, the followers. They were all taught to shoot. No one was excluded. Robust and realistic training was essential if under the strain of battle, exhausted soldiers could conquer their fear, think clearly and shoot straight in a crisis, and inspire maximum physical and mental endeavour. Secondly, they required arms and services to cooperate with each other in unimaginable ways. Artillerymen were trained to expect attacks on their gun positions and to fight off attacks without calling in the infantry to repel them. Tank men were trained to use their guns to snipe enemy defensive positions and fight a ground attack. Hurry bombers became airborne artillery, called in by anyone who could operate a radio. Incidentally, I discovered actually how closely the armed forces, the armed services, and the Army and the Air Force cooperated. I discovered that Slim had insisted that all officers use the same mess. So the RAF and Army officers started using the same messes. You might think it's an obvious thing to do, but it wasn't. And a new sense of collaboration was developed. Third, this approach demanded battalion, brigade, and divisional commanders high quality, men who would hold their nerve in times of acute crisis and who could inspire the soldiers to give their last ounce of commitment. I always like using this photograph because anyone know who it is? Lancelot Perot. He commanded 23 long-range penetration brigade operating above Kohima during the operations in 1944. One of the Chinook brigades that had been diverted from Wingate. But he had a ferocious moustache. He was an anti-aircraft artilleryman, actually, very well. We also needed an efficient air transport system because it was by air that stuff was supplied to the troops rather than by road. Right, here we go. Let me wrap up. Some of you may well have read the late Professor Norman Dixon's classic book on the psychology of military incompetence, and indeed may have heard him speak on the subject, as I have. Well, amongst many other things, he observed that the key ingredients in military blunders have been commanders with a predilection for frontal assaults, often against the enemy's strongest point, an issue I raised earlier, a belief in brute force rather than a clever ruse, and a failure to make use of either surprise or deception. Actually, I think you've written a book on this, haven't you? Did you look at Dixon?
Yeah.
Slim was not temperamentally or professionally disposed towards an attritional or confrontational approach to warfighting, an approach he had eschewed from his earliest days of soldiering, and which he had regarded with horror whenever he saw it applied. An anecdote from his early career pays testament to this. A sergeant major, noticing Slim's perusal one day of the Principles of War, he was reading the book which said Principles of War on it, issued to every soldier, told him there's only one principle of war, and it's this: hit the other fellow, quick as you can, as hard as you can, where it hurts the most, when he ain't looking. And that old sergeant major had it absolutely sewn up. Slim never forgot the simple lesson. Consequently, both deception and surprise were employed as the keynotes of both the Infal and Kohima battles, and indeed of Arakan, and of Operation Extended Capital in 45, and acted decisively to attack the will of the enemy. And another wonderful phrase, Slim's approach was designed to shoot a goal when the referee wasn't looking. So British victory in Burma under Slim in 44 and 45 was achieved therefore by an army that applied with absolute consistency and devastating effect, an approach to warfare dramatically different to that deployed during the years of defeat. Slim's approach to thinking about how to defeat one of the most formidable enemies this country has ever faced was also startling in its modernity, what we would today call a maneuverist approach to warfighting. It's just the name that the British Army gives to its doctrine, based entirely on Slim's articulation of it in 44 and 45. It was a victory for the application of a doctrine that stressed preeminently the need to hit the enemy where he was weakest, then by the careful, selective, and cunning use of force to remove his will to live. The masterpiece of Allied strategy, as Kimmerer so rightly acclaimed, was the product of the calculated orchestration of a dynamic, skillful, and victorious army. Slim was the maestro who conducted it all. The basis of modern British doctrines, I've said, is based firmly on what Slim thought and practiced. Such is his legacy. Mountbatten was so in awe of what Slim achieved, he claimed him to be the finest British general of the Second World War. I happen to agree. From what you've heard tonight, I hope you do too. Thank you.